Okay, welcome back to part two. So, if you're working your way through the module, we're going to talk now about, I want to kind of introduce a little bit more um, about how biogeography operates as a science for anyone. Usually in this class, I have a wide variety of students with different backgrounds. And so you may be coming from maybe you're introduced to biology, but maybe you have a microbiology type background, or maybe you're a policy type person who doesn't have a strong scientific background, or whatever it is. I like to kind of lay out how this field of science operates because it's slightly different than other fields of science that you may have been exposed to or that you're maybe more familiar with. So, one thing I want to talk about is pattern versus process, and this sort of dynamic is not really unique to biogeography, but we'll talk about in a minute about how we come to these conclusions in a little bit different way. But inherently, a pattern is something that is non-random. It's repetitive variations of focal elements. In this case, when we say focal elements, we're referring to things like individual organisms or an entire species or a population of organisms, which isn't every organism of that species, but it's a group of them, or it could be a community or a bioregion or whatever it is. We're looking at patterns of those types of elements among spatial units or regions, and that again, you could be looking at, a very small area, or you could be looking at over a large area, you could be looking at a whole state or a entire part of a continent or an entire continent or whatever it is. Or sometimes we look along gradients, like along changing latitude or over area changing area or longitude or something like that. So you're looking for patterns of how biodiversity changes across different spatial units. Basically, is one way to think of this. And these patterns, if they exist, usually imply some type of causation. Now, not always, but we're trying to understand why those patterns are there. And if you see a pattern, there's oftentimes some sort of causation, and we can link that to a biological or ecological process, or both, that is explaining why that pattern exists in the first place. And this is sort of how biogeography operates. But this isn't really different from other sciences. I mean, most sciences look for patterns and try to explain them and test hypotheses for why you might see that. That's pretty common in science. What's um, different a little bit about biogeography is that in a lot of field sciences that involve sort of field work instead of lab work, is that it's natural experiments instead of manipulative experiments. And what I mean here is, a manipulative experiment is what you would have in a lab setting where you can really control almost every variable or many variables in a really controlled setting in a really specific way. Whereas if you're in the natural environment, if you're out doing field work, we can't, manipulate the real world in that way. And so the way that we come to our conclusions is a little bit different, and the way that we conduct our scientific studies is a little bit different. So what you'll see is that these are referred to as natural experiments. And I found this definition. I think it's pretty good. A natural experiment is a real world situation that resembles an experiment without any intervention or control. The term is used for empirical studies based on variables and control groups that occur spontaneously. So basically, um, there are conditions, in the real world where we can go out and say, okay, there's different groups here, or, they're located in different locations, and we can use that as sort of control groups and perform our tests. And that's, in a broad sense, how we do things in biogeography. If you wanted a specific example, I'm a tree ring and forest ecology scientist. And so some of the ways we get around, because you can't, to give you an example here, we can't manipulate an entire forest, much less if we're doing continental studies. You can't manipulate an entire continent. You can't change the temperature and see how trees react. Like well, we can't. We're actually changing the temperature unintentionally, but we can't, manipulate it like in a lab. Or you can't, dump rain on an entire forest or something like that. But what we can do is, pick certain species of trees in certain locations and in certain areas. And so we're choosing which trees to sample and making comparisons that way. And depending on, that's going to change depending on what type of question you want to answer. If you want to figure out how a forest is responding to climate change, you might sample a variety of species in different locations, and you might want to go back in time. Like one thing we do is core trees. So we drill into these trees and take cores, and that allows us to look at conditions in the past, because trees are old and they grow over a variety of years, and we can look at conditions in the past that way. And so you're basically selecting certain species, certain sites, and certain techniques to get around this idea that you can't, or this fact that you can't can control or manipulate the real world. And so we can simulate that by sampling in certain ways. So that's sort of what a natural experiment is getting at, and that's a lot of how biogeography operates. It's not just specific to forest ecology. If you can't manipulate the ocean, you're just going to have to sample in certain ways so that you can try to figure out the question that you want to answer. Okay, something else that I want to sort of introduce here is these concepts of uniformitarianism and actualism. You may, if you've taken environmental classes, have been exposed to one of these. Uniformitarianism is a more common concept that people are usually aware of. And it is the assumption that the physical and biological processes operating on Earth today have operated throughout time, and that they are manifestations of a universal scientific laws. Usually this is applied in the context of geology. So basically what people are saying here is that, the formation of Earth's surface, the crust is moving, and you have earthquakes, and continents are moving around, and volcanoes and things over long periods of time. Those sorts of processes operated in the past the same way that they operate now. That doesn't mean that they operated with the same frequency or intensity, but just that a volcano, firing off 20, 30, 40,000 years ago is going to have the same type of effects that one if a volcano erupted today, or that the continents are moving in ways that are similar to how they moved in the past. It's not like continents have new forms of movement, So basically this is the concept that allowed scientists early on to say, if this is true, then the Earth is much older than they had previously thought. And we accept uniformitarianism as a true concept now. And so that sort of allows us to make some other types of assumptions when we're studying how these things happen. But it's not really exclusive to geology. And sometimes you'll see it referred to as actualism in other types of in other fields, where it's sort of here the processes and forces driving things like speciation, dispersal, extinction operated in the past by the same mechanisms that they do today, again with varying rates and relative importance. And so this is probably more the context that we're going to talk about things. I mean, we will talk about geology, but we're really more interested in these sorts of things. And so the evolutionary mechanisms that control whether a new species forms or not are the same in the past as they are now. It may have a different, the specific driver could be different in one instance over another, but in terms of like the genetic changes that happen and how that process happens is essentially the same in the past as it is now, and that it's not just specific to new species being formed, but how organisms move around, and if or when they go extinct, and things like this. So it's sort of the uniformitarianism concept applied to ecology and evolution, and biogeography. Okay, so I just want to sort of briefly mention a few things about modern biogeography and how it's a relatively new science. It's not as old, you know. Early on, if we think about some of the earliest people who are doing stuff like this, like the Charles Darwins and the Linnaeus and um, Alfred Wallace and those types of people were certainly doing biogeography, but they didn't call it biogeography. They were sort of called naturalists, and they were doing lots of different types of science all kind of at once. But now we have so much information that there's a lot of specialization, that you have to be kind of a specialist because there's just so much information out there. So things operate a little bit differently now, and biogeography is a relatively new science on its own compared to some others. And it's just due to the nature of the types of questions you're trying to answer, it requires a lot of data. And so in this field, sharing data and working with other people is sort of built into the history of how this science has come about. And it's kind of foundation to doing biogeography is that you need lots of data. You don't really see specific individuals coming out with individual papers and projects very often because you need a lot of people to contribute data to answer these types of questions. And in that way, it's a kind of a holistic science. Lots of people contribute to it. It's both holistic and interdisciplinary at the same time. It's really composed of, biogeography isn't really an entity on it in itself. It's sort of a combination of all these other fields in one. Like you can't just do biogeography. You're also, you're going to have to do different types of science at the same time, and this might be earth sciences. So you might have to pull in information from geology or climatology or limnology, which is like aquatic lakes and things like that, or oceanography. And you're going to definitely pull in life sciences. Ecology is maybe the most closely related field to biogeography, but also systematics, evolutionary biology, definitely geography is in the name, and paleontology. So all of these things sort of combine. All of them get used, and you may not use all of them in a single study, but you're going to be using more than one to be answering these questions, and that means that different researchers are going to be contributing to the same projects. Nobody's all of these things. There's no scientist who does all of these things, and so you're working with other people. And it's interdisciplinary and holistic in that way. So it's a really cool. I think it's cool. I think that's the most interesting part of this science is that no matter what you're interested in, almost everything there's always something in there for everybody. So it's a really cool. That's what makes it cool, I think. And on that note, consilience is sort of building on this, where it's the principle that information from unrelated sources or fields, when intersected, can provide greater scientific insight and rigor, and ultimately stronger conclusions. So, it's sort of like the old adage of like, you're looking at a picture and you can only see a part of it. And you have to guess what that picture is. The rest of it's covered up and you only see a tiny picture. If lots of people look at different parts of the picture and then come together and describe what they saw as a group, you can sort of start to figure out what the picture is. There's like a parable or like a phrase. I think it's like something about blind men putting. I should have looked this up before I started recording this, but like, I think it's actually like, 6 blind men put their hand on a different part of an elephant, and one of them touches the tusk and one of them touches the tail or something, and individually they can't figure it out, but if you put them together, they can start to figure out that, oh, they touched an elephant. It's that same concept where an individual scientist is only looking at a small sliver of the picture, even though you're studying all sorts of things. If you put more information together from different sources, you can start to get a better idea of what's going on. So that's sort of how that operates, and that's sort of built in fundamentally to how biogeography operates. Okay, So I think I've talked enough. If you keep working your way through the module, there's another reading and then discussion questions. And then something to keep in mind is that at the end of these modules, there will be either a quiz or an assignment for you to do. So keep in mind that once you get through the module, to make sure you do that as well. Okay, so that's it for me, and keep working your way through the module, but this is the last lecture video of this module, so I will see you next week.